acknowledge the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Katsi, Kwikwetlem, Kakad, Kwetlim, Sinaho, and Swasan peoples on whose unceded territories our three campuses reside. Because this presentation, people attending do spread in three campuses of Simon Fraser. So we acknowledge that. So again, welcome. This is our final town hall. We're hoping that this does give you the critical information about the principles for the open science work that we're doing. So I said, Nilay will be helping us to navigate the principles. She's been intimately involved in drafting the principles document and knows the field really well. What we're trying to achieve today is to give you information on open science as well as the open science principles that we've drafted. Obviously, get your opinion on changes or questions or concerns about the open science principles, advice, if you will, on how to move it forward for the next stage. We also want to make sure we have open and dynamic dialogue with our group here. The project was supported or is supported by the Tannenbaum Open Science Institute in McGill University. Tannenbaum Open Science Institute, or TOSI as it's called, was established probably 6 or 7 years ago, and was put in place to help facilitate open science practices across institutes in Canada. That would be universities, as well as research institutes, research hospitals, and so on. We worked with them and got a 1-year buy-in project. The buy-in project is meant to provide a way to assess the landscape at the institute, to collate the open science practices, or talk about how to move into a more complete open science framework for the given institute. So, and after these policies and principles are discussed, there's also the development of an implementation plan that's back to TOSI afterwards. And if they're happy with the draft principles and the plan, then they provide additional support going forward as part of the partnership for the Open Science Institute. I will mention that SFU is the first one to go in as the entire university. Every other application thus far is focused on institutes or departments. We will be the first one to come in as an entire university, which is why we're having these town halls. So what I'm going to do next is to provide some overview on open science, some of the benefits, and then how we build that Open Science Institute, but also reinforce the fact that we have a lot of things in place already that really reflect open science. Some of them are actually quite progressive compared to other institutes across Canada, so we're quite far ahead already in that. I'll then turn it over to Nilay for the draft principles, cover some of the next steps, and then we'll do our Q&A after that. So if you want a really good coverage of open science principles and what their agreed upon practices and principles are globally, there is a document from UNESCO, as to where this figure came from, that gives you a pretty broad view of what it means to engage in open science. And the emphasis here is really to focus on the fact that open science is really meant to provide access to knowledge globally, to break down barriers, to foster the culture of inclusivity and diversity in research and its impact. And that's really, part of the core principles for SFU, and that's where I think it's a nice sort of simpatico, if you will, to use that bad term, to integrate, these ideas of cultural inclusivity and diversity, but also say we're doing this as an SFU principle is inherent in how we think about what our responsibilities are. Open science also helps with the reliability, reproducibility issues that are inherent in a lot of the open science, or science in general. It does also facilitate evaluation by open peer review, and it helps to facilitate collaborations and reduce the redundancy and help researchers work together to build on each other's work, which increases the impact as well as the sensitivity for research going forward. For SFU faculty, staff, and students, engaging in open science does increase the visibility and potentially the impact of research through collaborations as well as sharing data. It does provide a mechanism to accelerate knowledge mobilization. I don't have to give you examples, but one of the ones that's more palpable in terms of the more present one is actually how fast we managed to work through the COVID crisis by having knowledge mobilization as sort of part of the open science principles and acting on them directly for COVID in particular. It does provide quite a broad opportunity for training. This includes just the training around open science. That includes informatics, computer science, but also making use of those resources for training. So putting together hackathons, for example, for students to work on data sets and giving access to the kind of data that people may not be able to collect themselves, but through sharing are able to work with things. For example, like neuroimaging data, not everybody has a scanner that they can access. So open science allows people to access these kinds of data. It also provides educational opportunities for particular, again, applications technologically, but also in terms of the thematic applications as well. It does increase collaborative efforts. Certainly in my lab, we have a lot of collaborations that involve sharing these large data sets, and it has benefited a lot for my students and staff to be able to access these data for thesis work, but also just to increase collaborations. A lot of the funders are really enforcing, if you will, or suggesting at least that people try and engage in open science, and there are some incentives to do that. And again, open science does align with the core values for SFU, going from innovation, but also collaboration and community engagement, that we are sharing our information, and that's part and parcel of who we are, and that's the principle for open science. It is building on things we already have in place at SFU. Through the library, there's an open access policy that does support the publication, for example, of scientific findings, but also helps with data flow, educational resources for training. Public Knowledge Project is one of the largest efforts to share information publicly, and it is not actually it's chaired or grows out of SFU. SFU is the hub for the Public Knowledge Project. There are complementary strategies and initiatives that are coming from SFU. The data management strategy, which is becoming extremely important as we start moving towards open science framework and being able to share data. Data management in and of itself really helps to ensure that data can be used by others. SFU Innovates has the nice sort of models for how to help translate intellectual property so it has maximum impact. And also the intellectual property policy does support open innovation in the sense that the intellectual property is inventor owned, which is again unique in Canada and allows more flexibility in how intellectual property is developed. So with that, I will now move the slides over to Nilay.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Nilay. I'll just briefly go through the principles, as Randy mentioned, that we drafted one by one, very briefly, which will guide our open science implementation plan. Please feel free to unmute yourself to ask questions about each principle, and we are going to also have the Q&A at the end. So we have a total of 6 principles and a preamble. Oh, it doesn't work. Oh, yes. So the preamble basically includes the definitions of open science and its importance, as Randy mentioned. But there are also a couple of important points that we make early in the document. One of them is to our goal to move from open science to open scholarship. And this is because at SFU, we are conducting scholarship in very diverse ways and using very different methodologies. So we really wanted our definition of open science to include all types of scholarships conducted within SFU and incorporate not only the scientific disciplines, but also the humanities, social sciences, and different forms of knowing. We then briefly mentioned that the well-known FAIR data principle made by the European Commission which states that scholarly information should be as open as possible and as closed as necessary. So open here is in order to foster the reusability and accelerate research, but at the same time, they should be as closed as necessary to safeguard the privacy of the subject and the participants. And when I go through these principles today, many of them we listed in the draft is about clarifying these two different tensions in open scholarship. And we will try to clarify like how they play out and how we see them like in the existing principles and how we engage in open scholarship. And then we mention also the autonomy of researchers and their basically right to decline participation in activities under the SFU's Open Science Framework, which is basically highlighting that these are intended as recommendations and guidelines, not forced policies. So the autonomy and the decisions of each researcher will be respected here. And if you want to contribute to open scholarship efforts, you should be able to get all the information you need and the support you need from SFU. And finally, we also highlight that the best practices for open science implementation need to really consider different stakeholders that are included in any stage of the open scholarship project. This is because many of us collaborate with different communities and have partnerships in our research and scholarship efforts. So it's just about like acknowledging that. I'll be moving to principle 1. Okay. That is transformation through equitable practice of open science. So the first principle really is highlighting our goal, how open scholarship as a practice aims to involve the inclusion of all persons with an interest in research to have access and can benefit from the scholarly knowledge generated at SFU, and break the barriers that prevent them to contribute to the generation of these scholarly knowledge. So this can involve non-academic actors, global scholars from non-English speaking countries and communities. It also includes opening up of the workflows across various stages of the research lifecycle, starting from ideation, planning to evaluation, and to allow for reuse. So it's not only about giving making openly available the very final knowledge creation and like the papers that you publish, but it's all about the whole research life cycle and making that available as much as you can, which ties us to the principle 2. What do we need to do to make our scholarly practices equitable? So principle 2, open sharing of scholarly knowledge, really outlines how we can achieve this transparency and accountability in scientific research to achieve increased collaboration and inclusivity, which is our goal. So you may have heard of FAIR principles of data sharing, which suggests that scholarly knowledge needs to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And scholarly knowledge within that sense includes materials that will be generated in all stages of the research lifecycle, as I mentioned before. So that will include the data, metadata, can be educational resources that you generate, models, hardware, software, preprints, or published articles. And we highlight here that reasonable efforts need to be made to share these resources while considering also the accessibility of the tools required for our resources to be usable by other researchers and people who would like to access them. And there is a very appropriate question here on how we achieve these as a scholar, as like we need to be knowledgeable about which tools to use, but also need to have the resources. And we are going to come back to that point in a later principle. But before that, we wanted to add these 2 more principles that highlight the circumstances in which the scholarly knowledge may not be openly shareable. So principle 2, respecting participant autonomy. basically highlights how the research ethics requirements really override open data principles. A participant or a partner organization or a community whose data you might be using, or maybe you are collaborating during the activities, scholarly activities, they can decline sharing their information. And they should not be receiving any adverse effects or treatment as a result of this choice, and this choice should be respected. And following a similar principle, principle for respecting the dignity and privacy of research participants, this principle basically details the legal and ethical frameworks that need to be followed, which may include the Tri-Council policies, the First Nation principles, international regulations, to name a few. So we just highlight here that it is the responsibility of the researcher to provide participants with enough information for them to make fully informed decisions about participating in the OS. For example, they should be able to understand where, how, and which part of data is shared, and any information about the future use and how their data is being anonymized should be also shared with the participants. So data usage agreements, ownership rights, including all forms of collective ownership, needs to be respected. And last but not least, proactive responsibility of care needs to be taken when data is collected from vulnerable or marginalized communities. So these principles 3 and 4 really highlights the ethical practices and respecting the privacy of participants, as they should have the ownership over their data and they should be well informed. So these two principles is highlighting that as close as necessary part of the tension that I was mentioning. And moving on to principle 5, ensuring success of the open science framework at SFU through institutional commitment and support. So this was what I was initially mentioning in principle 2. Open science practices, especially if you don't have a working infrastructure and methods in place, can put a lot of burden on scholars, especially if you don't have access to the correct tools, or you might not even know what the correct tools might be. So for us as SFU to be successful in our goal to achieve university-wide open scholarship, we really need to provide certain types of support to scholars. And this can include the infrastructure, the financial support, or funding that helps us to contribute to open science. Any materials, tools, equipment, or software needed to openly share the scholarly knowledge, and providing the educational materials and training required for the researchers, staff, or the trainees, like our students, to understand what is required to be able to participate in open science. And another form of support we highlight here is the incentives for practicing open science, which can include the recognition of open science resource creation as an academic contribution, and maybe supporting also to consider recognizing open science activities in departmental and faculty tenure and promotion guidelines. And the final principle focuses basically on IP, which was a priorly frequent question we got. Principle 6 says prioritizing translation with a harmonized approach to IP. So SFU's IP policy is inventor-owned, which means that inventors maintain control over their IP, which is great and also unique for SFU. Many universities don't do this. So this principle really highlights the importance of not having restrictive access to IP or not enforcing patent rights against other researchers and scholars, which could lead to monopolization of knowledge and research. And this can still be done by keeping IP rights and benefits from it and commercial control over your work. As an example, in my line of work in AI, we have currently novel open access licensing options that restrict commercial use while being open to research and individual use. Similarly, IP ownership can be handled in ways in which that will allow for scholars and individuals to benefit from the knowledge generated, but where like the scholars who own the IP still can able to gain commercial control over their work. This is not my area of expertise, but I will try to explain it if you have further question on this. And this concludes the principles we currently drafted. One thing to repeat that Randy already mentioned, that this is a draft and we are asking your feedback to really incorporate everyone's input. The full draft document is also, I think, shared if you'd like to take a look. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Nilay. So just what's coming up next? The project itself started actually in the spring, but the basic kickoff was in early in June. A lot of planning just to get things started. The working group is sort of the core group that oversees the link between the principals themselves and the various departments and faculties that are engaged. So we have representations from the VP office, as well as some some of the deans, as well as some people on some of the administrative groups. The principals drafting committee, those are the ones I mentioned that actually were involved in putting pen to paper to get these principles in a way that we could look at them and start working and develop them to integrate with other principles that have been used by other groups. There's been some interaction between the working group and the drafting principals committee. We're now starting in the January, we had our town halls. This is the last of the 3. And then next week, there are 2 focus groups. I do encourage you that if you're interested and able to help us with this focus groups, it'll be a more in-person conversation. There'll be probably coffee and donuts as an added incentive for some sort of food there. Kelly will be in person on campus to lead those focus groups. So I do encourage you to attend if you possibly can. I'll give some more information on that in a moment. Once we have the survey results and these consultations done, we'll merge them to try and revise the principles based on these discussions, bring them back to the working group for discussion around that, as well as working on the 3-year implementation plan, and then get that back to OC again in June. That will be like the 1-year project essentially for us. The focus groups, there'll be 3 next week. They'll all be on Burnaby campus in the library, and they are thematically organized. The first one to talk about the practices and institutional support for open science. The second one more around the ethical aspects about participant autonomy, dignity, and privacy. And the final one will be on the intellectual property issue that Nilay was mentioning is a bit touchy, but we want to make sure we get good coverage for how that should move forward as a principle around intellectual property. So again, if you're interested, please send us emails and let us know that you can attend one or all of those focus group meetings. So there are detailed versions of the draft principles that you can access on our website. You can either do the QR code or go to the website directly. You may have gotten it also in the email, so it is there for your perusal. I think at this point, Kelly, if you want to stop the recording, we can now open up the floor to questions and answers.